Welcome to Centennial United Methodist Church here in Roseville. I'm Julia Nordling. I'm the parish nurse here, and I want to welcome all of you to this highly sensitive topic that we can learn about this evening. And I want to thank all of you for navigating our parking lot, which was dug up just this week, and finding a way in here. I'd just like to point out that there are refreshments in the back of the room, so help yourself. Restrooms, the ladies' restroom is directly across the hall from us here, and the gentlemen are around the corner. And once again, thank you for attending our presentation this evening.
Hello. I'm glad to see that you chose this rather than the Lynx celebration event. Go Lynx, though, yes. My name's Ed Holland, and I'm a United Methodist minister, and we want to thank Centennial Church and Julia for their warm hospitality, and so let's thank Julia and Centennial Church. As we begin, I would like to invite you to join me in a few minutes of, or a few moments of silent reflection as we remember those who've been harmed by the natural and human-caused disasters in recent weeks. So please join me in a moment of silence. May the words that we speak, the thoughts that we think, and the things that we do be acceptable and blessed by you, Abba, our loving Creator, our guide, and our friend. Amen. I'm a member of the Interfaith Coalition for End-of-Life Options, and our mission is to promote the understanding and acceptance of diverse religious and spiritual related end-of-life decisions and discussions. And I'd like to introduce other members of our team. If you could just stand briefly. The Reverends Harlan Limpert, Margaret McRae, and David Breeden. So thank you all very much for your help in arranging this. I'd also like to acknowledge Senator Chris Eaton, of the State Senate. She is the chief author of the End-of-Life Options Act. I'm glad you could be with us tonight. Before we introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to invite Dr. Rebecca Thome to give a brief overview of our topic for tonight. Rebecca manages Doctors for Dignity and the Minnesota Campaign for End-of-Life Options. Rebecca?
Thanks. Thank you all for being here tonight. So I am Rebecca Thome, and I work for Compassion and Choices, and Compassion and Choices is a national nonprofit whose mission is to improve care and expand choice at the end of life. We work in a number of areas. Tonight we're here to talk about our advocacy, which is around making medical aid in dying available to all Americans. It is currently available to 18% of Americans because 6 states and the District of Columbia have currently authorized the practice. And I just wanted to start by making a few kind of background points to be sure we're all on the same page before our guest launches into his discussion. So medical aid in dying is a medical practice whereby a terminally ill adult who has sound decision-making capacity can choose to request a medication that they would then self-ingest for a peaceful death. Oregon's had the law for 20 years. It's known as the Death with Dignity law there. Washington State has had it for 10 years. Vermont is coming up on 5. California is coming up on a little over 1 year. And then, as you know, Colorado and Washington, D.C. have also passed the law. So it's a very strict and specific process whereby a terminally ill person must be confirmed by 2 physicians that they're appropriate, that they qualify. And what we know is that the way this has worked in Oregon is that more than 90% of the people are in hospice at the time, which is really important because they're getting a full team of support health professionals, clergy around them to help them with their end-of-life journey. And medical aid in dying is not an alternative to hospice care. As we can see in Oregon, it's been very well integrated into hospice and end-of-life care. It's just another option, such as palliative sedation, people who stop eating and drinking at the end of life. So I think of it as one other option for people to choose from. The other thing I want to mention is that data has been collected from Oregon for 20 years now and Washington. And data has shown us that the people who are most often using this option have cancer. That's the #1 diagnosis. More than 80% have cancer. The next most common is neurologic disorders such as ALS and Parkinson's. And in the 20 years that Oregon has had this law, this is an approximate number, guess how many prescriptions have been written in 20 years? Think in your head, 1,200. That's how many people have ingested the medication in 20 years. So it's not often used, but it provides great peace of mind for everyone who knows that this option is available to them. So I'm really pleased that we're taking a look at this issue from a religious and spiritual point of view tonight. You all have cards and pens. If you have questions, as you think of questions as Reverend Castuera speaks, please write those down and we'll collect them at the end. We want to have plenty of time for Q&A, and even comments if you're well behaved. So I'm going to read this introduction because he is very accomplished and I can't remember it all. Reverend Dr. Castuera is a graduate of the School of Theology at Claremont, California, where he studied and wrote about the problems of violence and the patriarchal worship of a mother goddess in Mexican culture. After completing his education, Ignacio served churches in Mexico, Hawaii, and California. And as I think he will tell you, he's worked in the poorest of churches and the wealthiest of churches, and has a strong commitment to social justice. He was the first Mexican-American district superintendent of the United Methodist Church in the Los Angeles district, and went on to become the pastor of Hollywood United Methodist Church, where he transformed that church into a center of the growing movement aimed at creating a positive religious response to the AIDS pandemic. 6 years before his retirement, Reverend Castuera became the first national chaplain for Planned Parenthood Federation of America. An accomplished preacher and author, Ignacio edited a collection of sermons gleaned from those given by various pastors from multiple denominations on the Sunday after the infamous Rodney King riots. His book is called Dreams on Fire, Embers of Hope from the Pulpits of Los Angeles After the Riots, and it was one of the top 10 religious books of 1992. In 2015, Reverend Castuera became involved in the California campaign for end-of-life options, working with the family of Brittany Menard and coming to her defense when the Vatican called Brittany's use of the Oregon Death with Dignity law, quote, reprehensible, and an action that would be, quote, condemned. A member of Compassion and Choice's board of directors, he believes strongly that everyone should have access to a full range of end-of-life options, including medical aid in dying. Recently retired, Reverend Castuera currently heads the Latin American project of the Center for Process Studies. He manages the website religion-online.org, a free resource on religion used mostly by those who cannot afford printed materials. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Castuera.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. I'm very pleased to see so many of you here. I think this is a proof of how important this issue is, and I hope that each and every one of you will make a commitment to really change the situation in your own state, so that any person who wants to avail herself or himself of the privileges that this law would grant them could do so. And this is a growing movement. There is a current issue of the magazine that Compassionate Choices puts together. And it has a very good report about the number of states that already have passed the legislation and others that are considering the legislation. And I know you're getting very close, and I know that you will keep on working to make sure that either yourself or someone you love, that you'll be able to say, I've had something to do with passing this law that is first and foremost a permissible kind of a thing. It's not you're not enforcing anything on anyone. Whenever opponents of this law come up, and as they did in California, and try to impose fear on those of us who wanted to see it passed, I always ask them about that. And why is it that you want to impose your perspectives on me when I am not doing the same? I am supporting a law that will permit you to do what you want, but also will permit me to do what I want. And I was coming, of course, from a perspective of a Latino, a Mexican American, who actually had seen in both my parishes and in my own family life how a law like this could have affected the way in which my parishioners met their end in a more dignified way. And also, I would say, my own family members. I was very fortunate, my father was very fortunate in that he chose not to ask for any more medical assistance for anything. He told us on January 20 of 2003, at the age of 90, I think he had the worst year of his life, was his last year after a pacemaker was placed on him, but it actually didn't do the job, and he had to have oxygen all his life, and all that year. And of course, we enjoyed having him around, but he did not enjoy being around us anymore, and it made me realize, don't be so selfish. Why do you want him around when he doesn't want to be around? And he told us he never mastered English. He could understand quite a bit, but he never used it to speak. But he said, "No le tengo miedo a la muerte, pero no me gusta el dolor." He said, "I am not afraid to die, but I just don't want pain." So when he summoned us on that January 20th, he said, "I don't want anybody to touch me anymore." He had gallstones, and the doctors were proposing to have a drain to make his life a little bit easier. And he said, "I don't want to be touched anymore. I just want to go." And so what he did was he just refused to eat, refused medication, was given some liquids to keep him going for a little while. And also because we had some friends that were able to do this for us, we were able to get sedatives for him. So his death was not a torture kind of that can be for someone that also does the same thing, because to die from lack of food and lack of water is also can be very, very painful. And fortunately for my dad, it wasn't that way. That just solidified my commitment. I already, in principle, and having seen parishioners go through all kinds of terrible experiences, including violent deaths, that experience with my father solidified my commitment to see that our own state of California could be then blessed, and I mean that seriously, with a law that would permit people who choose to die with dignity this particular way, in ways like it is in Oregon and these other states where we have it now, that now I said, I will commit myself to see that my own state has that law. And of course, that possibility opened up and accelerated when a Californian, a wonderful young woman, she was only 29 years old at the time that she confronted this terrible situation that she faced. Brittany Maynard decided that since California did not have that law, that she would then go to live in Oregon, establish residence there, and then avail herself of the law there. One of the things that this move on her part dramatized for us Californians was the fact that she was wealthy enough. She wasn't super rich, but she had enough money. Her parents had enough money as well and helped in the whole process to allow her to move to the state of Oregon, where then she was able to die with dignity. That option was not open to poor Californians. It wouldn't have been open for the majority of my parishioners. I did serve one church where the parishioners there could have gone to Zurich if they wanted to, or a place like that, take a final vacation with grandpa, whatever, and I have also met people who were able to do that. But why should we not have a law in our state, in your state, where anyone of whatever social and economic status can avail themselves of this death with dignity as they define dignity? You don't have to define dignity for them. But I hope that we are able to ensure that no one prevents people from deciding this is the way I would like to go. It seems to me, of course, that is absolutely congruent with the tenets of most people of faith. I mean, the tenets, not how the people of faith had internalized those tenets, because people pick and choose. If you remember, one of the great presidents of the United States had his own Bible, and he applied the scissors to it to make sure that there were some things that he did not agree with. He said, so every person of faith also pays either more attention to this or more attention to that. In technical terms, we talk about the canon within the canon. The canon of the Bible in itself is not the canon that each and every one of us commits to. Some people say, oh, the Gospel of John and the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, give me that and I don't need anything else, Well, they have a canon within a canon, right? But when I'm speaking about the best tenets of the faiths of and the religious faiths of people, the best tenets do permit for this kind of option for any person who practices that religion with faithfulness. I am very much acquainted with the beliefs in Judaism and Islam and Buddhism, and one of the things that seems to be a common element in all of those religions is the issue of compassion. And in the case of the people of the book, Jewish, Muslims, and Christians, we have the additional teaching of having the image of God in us. And that part of having the image of God in us, if God is compassionate, then if we have that image of God in us, then compassion should also be part of our own makeup. And we should have compassion towards others and compassion for ourselves as well. So when someone decides that they cannot take this kind of suffering, and they have been told by doctors there's nothing more that we can do. All of the very careful ways that have been followed in Oregon and that have been copied basically by almost all of the other state legislatures that have passed the law, they are very carefully crafted and time-tested, because by the time you have 20 years of a record, and you cannot give credence to the naysayers and the frightened people who say, people are just going to force others to do this or force others to do that. None of that has occurred in 20 years. and I don't believe it will occur, because the framers of the law have made it in such a way that the dignity of the individual is the uppermost in the minds of those who crafted all of these things. Now, my personal faith, of course, as has already been indicated, I am a Christian. I grew up in Mexico as a Roman Catholic in the years before Vatican II, and at the age of 13 I became a Methodist. On the last Sunday of October, after attending a Halloween party in the Methodist Church in Puebla, then I got intrigued by what I had experienced at that party, and then I went to Sunday school the next day, and I never looked back. I have returned to Catholic churches for all kinds of wonderful events. I'm very much of a supporter of the current Pope. I always hasten to say that when I spoke defending Brittany, a different perspective was put forth, that does not coincide with the great love tenets and teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. And I'm a very strong supporter of the pan-cyclical, I call it, that the Pope Francis issued, in which he has such compassion for the whole globe. So how can we just care for all but not for individuals as well? We have to challenge ourselves and to say, how is our consistency there? But again, if someone says, no, I don't want to, fine, I will never force and I will never support any kind of legislation that would impose limits on the dignity of a person to make decisions of such import, such as how am I going to die, when I have been told that in the next 6 months I will die, and it will be a very painful death. So my mother would have been very different, and she was very different from my father. My mother had 15 surgeries in her lifetime, and she didn't seem to have any problem with pain. She had an extremely high tolerance for pain. She passed a huge kidney stone that she kept by her bedside and called her my fifth, because there were 4 of us in our family. And she said that that was a big challenge for her, because it was worse than all of the 4 births that she had. So, but she had tremendous ability to deal with the pain. I mean, she would not have understood why my father wanted to go, and she did not. My mom was not fully herself at the time my dad made that decision, and she was very angry with him. But in the final event, she gave in, because she realized I experienced pain in a totally different way from the way my father experienced pain. Hangnail was just terrible for my father. But so that we have to take into account individuality. We have to take into account personal choices. We have to take into account how each one of us defines what is important and what is not important. I think that's essential to the definitions that we give about our faith and about how we act in a manner congruent with our faith. I want to say just 2 more things. One, a general statement about what I believe about the nature of God and how that gets translated into ethical issues. And the other, specifically speaking as a Christian, how I think that some of our own observances and celebrations and rituals can assist us to enter in a more honest dialogue about issues of life and death. So the issue of the nature of God, as I said earlier, all of us have our canon within the canon, and John 3:16 and whatever it is that finally is really appealing to us, we have our own. But I think when we really seriously think about theology and about the nature of God, we have to be informed also by those who have studied more about the way in which churches and religions have developed. In the case of my own particular training, I went to the School of Theology at Claremont, as it was already mentioned, and I worked under John Cobb, who was influenced by Alfred North Whitehead. Alfred North Whitehead was a very intelligent man, very knowledgeable, the son of an Episcopal, an Anglican priest in England, studied a lot of religion himself. As a teenager, he finished most of the works of many of the great fathers of the faith, and I mean that literally, and the women did not write as much in the past, and was very much committed to at least understanding the way in which religions developed. He wrote a wonderful book called Religion in the Making. But it is in Process and Reality, which he wrote in the United States after having had a career as a logician, mathematician, physicist, and then Harvard invited him to teach philosophy, and he came to the United States in 1925. And there is where he wrote the last three major works. He wrote other essays and all that, but the three major works that he wrote were Science and the Modern World, Adventures of Ideas, and Process and Reality. And what I like about the way in which he moved in the direction of establishing a form of theism is that he did not start with a presupposition that there is a God. He started with other presuppositions, but when he came to the end of his magnus opus, when he came to put the whole thing together, he realized that he did need a principle of creativity and a principle of continuity as well, and that he needed to call it God. And he knew, of course, that some people might project upon that term their own way of understanding God, right? So in order to explain what he really meant, he then goes back a little bit into the way in which the religions of the world have used certain metaphors to refer to God. And you will recognize that in Christianity we use these three metaphors that he identified. God as an imperial ruler, God as a lawgiver, and God as a philosophical principle. Well, all three are present in historical Christianity. And but then he says, in the Galilean origins of Christianity, and Galilean refers to Galilee, the region of Palestine where Jesus did so much of his own work. And he says, in the Galilean origins of Christianity, there is another way about talking about God that draws its power from the tender elements of the world and dwells profoundly in love. Okay, so that's what he means when he says God, not the three other elements that are so present in our prayers, in our preaching, in our speaking, in our singing, in Christianity. You know, the almighty power of God, for instance, that is a reference also to this imperial ruler. Or so that's not what he wanted. He wanted us to concentrate more on the love element. And John Cobb has always emphasized that, and now at the ripe old age of 92, he has produced a wonderful book called Jesus' Abba, A-B-B-A, the God that has not failed. And what he does is he really builds up on what Whitehead had mentioned about this Galilean origin of Christianity. Recognizing that Christianity was co-opted by the Roman Empire and brought back very quickly the images that Whitehead warns us against. You know, the Almighty God is really a projection of Constantine's own image. You know, said God is this, and I'm God's representative. You know, he was opportunistic. Let's just admit it. And unfortunately, the church then bought that, and every now and then someone tried to go back, and you know, then heresies were declared, and then, you know, the images of love that Jesus gave was just almost disappeared. Whitehead uses the term flickered. You know, they have flickered in history. You know, but perhaps we are at a point in our lives and in the history of our faith when we can reach back to that Galilean vision and really begin to relate to God as a parent, as a daddy, as a papa. The word Abba is a baby talk kind of a term. And once we begin relating to God in that way, not as the fearful lawgiver, the fearful ruler, or as the mighty lawgiver, or even as this vague philosophical principle, when we relate to this papa, this daddy, this loving person, of whom we bear some, then maybe we can act in ways that are far more loving. And so as we consider this particular issue, or any other issue, how is it that a loving person who believes in a loving God can act in this particular situation? How is it that we react to someone who's in the midst of tremendous suffering, who has already been told by doctors that they probably will not live more than 6 months? Would it not be the right thing to do, given our belief, to act in that particular way and say, yes, if that's what you want to do, if that, respect the dignity of that person, and equally respect the dignity of a person who chooses not to avail herself or himself of that. So that's one thing. The other, now going back to the traditions and observances of the church, I want to state primarily with the Christian faith. I do know something about some of the other faiths, but in the Christian faith we have a number of opportunities to really talk with each other about the end of our days, and about ending those days in a dignified way, in a gentle way. Yesterday was the day when we observed the festivity, or the festival of the birth of Francis of Assisi. Francis of Assisi gave us a wonderful poem, All Creatures of Our Lord and King, in which he refers to death as a sister, gentle. It's just you're our gentle sister who takes us to God. And that is a beautiful image that he gave us, and of course the whole idea of that poem is to relate us to all of creation in giving creation a personality, if you please, and helping us to relate to brother sun and sister moon, mother earth, sister death, etc. It's a wonderful thing to do, that if we remember that at least one of the saints of the church, and others have been also doing that, but no one better, I don't think, than St. Francis of Assisi. In a few weeks, we will have another opportunity. As soon as we finish trick or treating, then we have All Saints Day and All Souls Day. This is a time to remember the dead. Now, not all of the branches of Christianity, and not in all of the countries in the world, are those days observed in the same way. I come from Mexico, and the Dia de los Muertos is a spectacular day. It's a wonderful day. It's a day when you really become one with the cloud of witnesses that Paul talks about. You relate to your aunt, your uncle, your grandparent, whoever it is, and people do go to the cemeteries and have picnics in the cemeteries and sing some of the favorite songs of the person that they are remembering. Something of that needs to happen in more Christian observances of All Saints and All Souls. Bring us together, because it says something about them and it says something about us. And it tells our children something about how we want to continue also to be related to them when we're no longer around. And it's just a wonderful acknowledgement of finitude. In America, it's very difficult to talk about finitude. I live in a state where cemeteries do not look like cemeteries. There's a denial of death in California, especially in Southern California, where everybody is young. They keep themselves very much in shape and all of that. And that's very good. I think people need to exercise and do all of those things. But when it goes overboard into an absolute denial of finitude, then it's negative. And it can be very, very damaging for our whole psyche and for our whole perspective. And so it seems to me that we do need these reminders. In the Middle Ages and even in the early Renaissance, we did not need that. Everybody knew for sure. I mean, there was no hiding from the reality of finitude. And poets left us with enough beautiful elegies and things like that that glorify those who have died. And painters. You know, one of the things that I did not know about before, but now I'm very mindful when I look at some of the paintings, what they call a Memento Mori, that they add to the painting, a remembrance of death. You know, that it's included in that painting. No matter how elegant and powerful the people that are being depicted in the paintings, somewhere in the corner or in one dark part over there's a little skull or something that is a memento mori. You remember that you're human and that you're going to die, and so that should encourage us to talk a little bit more honestly about this issue with one another. And I think again that earlier today when we were talking with Hamlin, the whole season of Lent, 40 days to talk very seriously about death and sacrifice and all those kinds of things that are important in order to really enhance our life. Because the more seriously we take death, the more we enhance our lives. You know, some people think it works the other way. No, I think if you know that, you know, this is how much you're going to have, well, you know, then really enjoy every day to its fullest, because it's going to end. It's going to end. And then at least have a conversation with people that you love and people that are important to you about how I want to end life. Not how I don't want to impose it on you, but I want to tell you how I want to do it. And please do respect that when that time comes, you know. And of course that will not happen unless we have the kind of legislation that we have now in a few states, and I do hope that you will pursue with great intensity the very difficult path of passing a legislation like that one, because our opponents keep on bringing all kinds of fearful kinds of things that emerge. I'm going to say primarily from their own fears as well, and they need to be assured by us that we do intend to respect their own perspectives and their own fears as well. Only then, I think, will we create the kind of consensus that will allow us to have that kind of permissible legislation that will allow the people that are convinced that God does not want to see her children, his children suffer, that this law is congruent with faith, congruent with love, congruent with real compassion. Thank you very much.
Question on a card, raise it up and we'll collect them.
First question. Why do you avoid the term assisted suicide?
I think it's extremely important to distinguish between suicide and assistance in dying with dignity. I have seen suicide in my ministry, and it doesn't look like what we're trying to do at all. And I think words matter. And even though the literal meaning of suicidio, indicates that someone is doing something against himself or herself to take one's life. In fact, the connotations of that word are completely different of what we're really talking about. We must be consistent. I think those of us who believe in medical assistance in dying, we must consistently avoid the term suicide because it does not apply. I'm going to just tell you the most tragic suicide that I saw as a pastor. Suicide is an act of anger, primarily. And this was the angriest suicide I ever witnessed in my whole life. It was a nurse, a woman that had two adult children by that time. And she had moved out of the Hollywood community. I was pastor in Hollywood, as has been stated. And one of the sons, the sons actually were raised by the church, literally. I mean, it's the closest to the oblate tradition of bringing the children to the church and let the church bring them up. You know, the church literally brought them up from their 11th or 12th year of life. She obviously had some major difficulties, but she was a nurse. She moved out of the community. The kids did reach out to her, and she continued to be in touch with them in some ways. And she did agree to come to the baptism of her first granddaughter, which took place on Mother's Day. And she took a room directly across from the church. The church is located in a very prominent place in Hollywood. It's a beautiful building. By the way, Hollywood was founded by United Methodists, or Methodists at the time, and it was called Hollywood Land at the beginning. That's part of the reason the church ended up with such beautiful real estate where they were located. And the man who built that building eventually became a bishop, so it's a gorgeous architectural jewel there. Directly across the street, there's a hotel. At that time, it was under Holiday Inn, and she took a room looking at the church from where she was. And then the afternoon after the baptism, she went into her room and called the two children, knowing that the children were not home, and left messages in their machines. And then she had absconded enough medication from her time as a nurse to just kill herself. So it was a very, the messages were not loving, caring, loving messages for the granddaughter or for the two sons. They were very hateful. It was a most difficult situation to confront as a pastor. Suicide is an angry act. It's not a compassionate act. It's not a loving act. And I will continue to avoid as much as possible, all the time, the term suicide to apply for this intervention, minor intervention, in the sense of giving the person a substance that person may or may not take. As you were informed earlier, less than 50% of the people who have received the medication in Oregon have actually used it. So it's not suicide, I'm sorry.
Could I just make a brief comment that I've heard people talk about suicide also as being a very lonely act?
A very
lonely act, as compared to medical aid and dying being very much something you can share with your family and with your loved ones. That's a huge difference.
And this situation is in community. The family is there. There's no loneliness. There's I'm sure, I know, in the case of Brittany, there was pain that was involved. There was not avoiding a certain amount of pain, but it's struggling together, compassionately, lovingly. You know, there are some videos on YouTube. If you look for Dan Diaz, the widower, he's an amazing human being. You know, it's just he's capable now of dealing with it a little bit better than at the beginning. At the beginning, it was extremely difficult for him to even stand up in front of people and talk about that experience. Imagine finding yourself with a wonderful wife, and he had waited such a long time to get married. He talks about that, and then being confronted by that. You know, so that was not suicide.
What would you say to someone who claims that any particular person's death is in God's hands? Medical aid in dying is seen as acting as God.
I would say that we are all collaborators with God. We collaborate with God when we extend life, or when we decide this is as far as I would like to go. I think, there was a time when appendicitis was completely deadly. I mean, that's it. You know, in Mexico they call it el torzón, because people would, just be grabbing themselves and all that. the latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, a lot of people just died very, very young, many of them, and all of that. And we collaborated with God and extended the life of many people, and thank God for medical science. And we collaborate with God. We make a joint decision to die. Again, the idea of God that emerges out of this, the thought of Whitehead and Cobb, is this loving God that's present in every second of my life, in every decision that I make. God is involved. And so, should I be at the point, should I be, if I were to be diagnosed, and decide that way, I will never feel that I'm making that decision alone. I am making that decision based on this trail, this trajectory of decisions in which God and I have been cooperating. Sometimes I've been closer to what God wanted me to do, and sometimes I have not, but it's been a very personal trajectory of cooperation with God. And so if I were to decide this is it, I believe that it's a decision that God is participating in. I am not going against God's will. Now, when you talk about God's will, then you're talking again about those other images of God that I do not accept. The God that pays no attention to me. And in essence, this is it. Whatever I say, that's when you go. No, as I have care for you at every step of your life, let's now confront this last step of your life as well.
In my experience as a hospice chaplain, I don't see many people who live in poverty. What's your experience with poor people and hospice, and is there a conversation to be had about the barriers and solutions by and with poor people at the end of life?
Yes, I sort of alluded to that in that, when we began thinking about the law for California, we were so blessed, I think, by the fact that Brittany wanted to talk. I mean, she could have just died alone and not make any big splash or anything like that. But she realized precisely that, that not everyone could avail themselves of all of the necessary help. Now, among the poor, it's very difficult for them to go into hospice situations. Insurances, all of those other kinds of things that are not available to them. So, if they were to have that opportunity, and again, this is where community is important. This is why I keep on arguing in favor of the church going on, even if people don't want to believe in God, that's fine. Just participate in some organization that promotes the common good, and in some ways, thank you. It's doing God rather than saying, So the poor really need to be given the same opportunities, at least, and have a hospice, and it's when it emerges out of a relationship again, that then they can go to a hospice and then that they can be cared for. But the way it is right now, it's very difficult for the poor to do that. I just have seen very few, actually, but I have seen a few, yeah.
A couple questions dealing with dementia. Can there be, and how can there be, compassionate choice or death with dignity for people who are living with dementia?
We have homework to do. Let's just face it, we have homework to do. My mother didn't go into Alzheimer's, but she was 92 years old, and the way in which her states of dementia manifested themselves were not destructive. They were actually quite funny, and I was the one who related the most to her, because what she did is she went back in time. She was still living in Mexico, and she was still talking about people who had died, and as if they were still alive, and would ask me, and my sister at the beginning said, well, you know, they died many years ago. No, just, you know, let's just play along a little bit, you know. So it's very different. You know, I've also seen the cases when people become very violent and very difficult to handle and all of that. So we do have homework to do. I think, for instance, there should be, and this is not something that's going to happen very soon, but there should be a way of incorporating the desires of a person when that person is at her best or his best, that those desires are respected should dementia or Alzheimer's come in. There should be that, but that's homework. That's a long ways away from us right now, so unfortunately.
Some Christians are against medical aid in dying because they believe suffering is redemptive and that they ought to live with this illness to learn what they can from it, the difference between pain and suffering.
Yes, I have heard that argument, and I have great admiration for those people who feel that there is redemptiveness in their own suffering that way. The way I understand redemptive suffering in the Christian perspective is that my suffering creates some redemption for somebody else, not that I am cleansed through my suffering. And in fact, if I read Hebrews, the epistle to the Hebrews, the argument is made there that Jesus already offered the sacrifice once and for all, so none of us have sacrifice. But for those who want to believe that there would be some redemptiveness for themselves in their own suffering, I don't want to stand on their way. You know, maybe there'd be some measure of purification for them. I personally have not seen it. It's very difficult to watch a person who's in just excruciating pain, you know, as a pastor, and knowing that you cannot do anything for them, you know, and that holding their hand and letting them know that you love them and all of that it's not sufficient enough. It's not strong enough. And I have not actually talked with someone who believed that redemptive suffering is possible. Then they go through the suffering and they continue affirming in the midst of their suffering that they are in the midst of the redemptive situation. I just have not had that opportunity. I would welcome the opportunity to meet such heroic kind of people. But as for me, I'm chicken. Thank you.
Me too. What do you think the impact of hospice care has had on the need for a law like this, medical aid in dying?
I'm extremely supportive of hospice care. I mean, as a pastor, I have a colleague who is a director of chaplains for a big hospice organization in Southern California. And he and I are on the same page. I mean, no question about it. I mean, he does not see any major clash between our activities, and he provides an incredible service. He and the chaplains that work with him, and the nurses, and all of the personnel that are taking care of these people in hospice. I live in a community that has 4 major retirement communities, which include also hospice care. At least 2 of them have very good hospice care. I have a very good friend right now who is in hospice care, and I'm so grateful for all of that. And as I said earlier, I wish that could be just expanded so many more people could have it. But I do not see any real clash. I do not understand it. I mean, when I talk to some of the people who are active in hospice care who think that there is a clash of ideas between us, I just don't see it. I mean, I think that we can work complementary.
What were the main barriers to passing this legislation in California?
Well, I think some of the things that are implied in some of the questions here, there were a few legislators that felt that their own faith called upon them to oppose it. Fortunately, there was a woman who had been a legislator in California who herself was dying and wanted to avail herself of this if it passed. She actually died before the law became active, but she did get to see it passed by her colleagues. So when she was talking to her colleagues, all of the opposition just kind of melted away. I mean, the opposition at large was still there, but not in the legislature itself. They were very polite. The legislators were very polite and listened to people, but the vote was not a major difficulty. You know, the vote was overwhelmingly on our side. And then, of course, the concern was about the governor, whether or not, because he actually studied with the Jesuits, and as a Roman Catholic, many of the Catholic leaders were writing to him, and there was a fear that he would not permit this to become a law. Fortunately, we were also able to get support from other Jesuits. That's a wonderful thing about the Jesuits, you know, where there are two Jesuits, there are three opinions. So we just got a hold of a couple of very good Jesuits, and also at about the same time, one of the most famous Jesuits in the world, Swiss theologian, and I'm blanking now on his name, Hans Küng. Hans Küng issued a letter in which he specifically stated that he was going to avail himself of the laws of his country, Switzerland, and that he was no John Paul II. Like me, he was not going to be heroic. He was losing all of the ways of having a meaningful life. He could not read very well anymore. Some people began reading to him and all that. And but he stated very clearly that he did not believe it was against, quote, the will of God for him to have a dignified death. So that was very helpful in convincing Jerry Brown to be on our side as well. So the opposition was vociferous, but it was basically the same old arguments that just did not cut. You know, I mean, they want to believe that? Yes, we're not going to take your beliefs away. And if you want to have redemptive suffering, you want to, whatever it is, this law will not do anything against you. But if your way is imposed on the rest of us, then it will do something against me. And I think that even if we did not convince them, we did convince the legislators.
Got one more for you. This is sort of an inside baseball one, but nothing to do with the Twins and the Yankees. The United Methodist Church's social principles are supportive of hospice care, palliative care, and death with dignity, but will not endorse medical aid in dying, at least at this time. And in California, the annual conference, there was legislation proposed in support of medical aid in dying. So my question is, how do we live with social principles with which we disagree?
Well, we keep on working to try to improve on them. That's the nice thing about the Methodist Church, in that we have every 4 years we have an opportunity to change our discipline, and so we work very strongly. I have been working, for instance, since 1972, when someone quite cleverly took the floor and added 7 words, I think it was, in relationship to a wonderful document that had been written about the dignity of homosexual persons. And so I've been fighting against that one since 1972, so if I need to keep on fighting on this one, I will just keep on fighting. And I think we need to get more Methodists to really discuss it openly and to hopefully eventually influence them. I think right now specifically, and this is completely an inside kind of situation with the Methodists, when the progressive wing of the Methodists was gaining ground on the conservative forces, the conservative forces began reaching out to globalism and created this global church where a person in Africa can vote against me. They were not wise enough to copy the methods of the Anglican community, where individual dioceses can be far more independent from the total kind of thing. And the Archbishop of Canterbury may not like women priests, but he has to live with the reality that the Americans have women priests. The American Episcopal Church has wisely decided to ordain. So that would be another way of battling it, to make sure that we retain in the United States the right to have certain ways of thinking and of acting that are approved by us here in the United States only, and that cannot be vetoed by somebody in Guatemala or in Guyana or someplace like that.
And interestingly, our bishop, Bishop O, is the chair of the Council of Bishops, and will be, well, again, inside baseball, but the Methodist Church is really on the verge of a potential schism related to homosexuality. I think we've got one more here. Should disabled people fear that they will be targeted?
That was one of the arguments that was tried in California as well. And no, the real short answer is no. Remember what I've been saying about this legislation. It gives permission to do something, and it empowers the patient. It doesn't impose anything on patients, so it empowers patients. So if the person happens to be disabled, that person does not want to avail herself or himself of this, then no one will have the right to do that. And I mean, I suppose that in abstraction one can think even of healthy people who could be abused by somebody, but in reality this law is so well crafted, has been so time tested, that I just do not understand well, I understand, but do not agree with the fears that some people just create to try to stop the ongoing movement. Most people in the United States are in favor of this, and its time has come. So, thank you.
Thank you. I believe that you can read the most current draft of the legislation, both the Senate file and the House file, online. And Chris, maybe you could help with the website for that. Do you know offhand?
Leg.mn.
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 And the bill numbers are at the top of that page.
Oh, yes, they're already on. Good. So please take a look at it. It is well-crafted legislation in my view.
Presentation at their church.
Pardon me?
Presentation at their church.
Oh, if you belong to a faith community and would like the interfaith clergy for end-of-life options to arrange for a presentation at your congregation, please talk to us. We'd be happy to facilitate that. But again, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Very important.
And we can't let them get away without a good Minnesota bag of goodies.
Thank you very much.